The fastest way to discover who truly believes they own your home is to watch what happens when you try to drive into it. The late afternoon sun hung low over the pine trees as I turned onto Willow Ridge Drive after a 4-day business trip across the state. My pickup truck rolled quietly over smooth asphalt while the familiar scent of warm cedar and freshly cut grass drifted through the open window. It should have felt like coming home. Instead, I spotted flashing blue lights long before I reached the entrance gate. 2 sheriff's patrol vehicles blocked the roadway. Their light bars reflected across the polished black iron gate that stood firmly closed even though it had always opened automatically for residents. A small crowd of neighbors lingered along the sidewalks pretending to walk their dogs while quietly watching whatever was about to happen. I slowed to a stop behind the patrol vehicles and shifted into park. The evening air felt unusually still. Even the birds seemed quieter than usual. One deputy stepped toward my truck with the calm, professional posture that comes from answering difficult calls every day. I lowered my window before he reached the door. "Good evening, sir," he said politely. "Can I see some identification?" His tone carried no hostility, only procedure. I handed him my driver's license and watched his eyes move between the card and the address printed beneath my photograph. Willow Ridge. The same address sitting less than 300 yards beyond the locked gate. He nodded once before walking back toward another deputy standing beside a woman dressed in an expensive cream-colored blazer and perfectly pressed slacks. Even from a distance, I recognized Cynthia Reynolds immediately. She stood with folded arms, speaking confidently while occasionally pointing toward my truck as if explaining something obvious. The deputies listened carefully. She smiled often. Too often. After several minutes, the first deputy returned holding my license. "Sir," he began carefully, "we received a report that an unauthorized individual was attempting to enter private community property." I looked past him toward the house I had purchased nearly 8 years earlier. Through the trees, I could barely see the roofline catching the last orange light of the evening. My porch, my mailbox, my driveway, everything exactly where I had left it before leaving town. "That property belongs to me," I replied calmly. The deputy nodded again. "The Homeowners Association president disputes that statement." I glanced toward Cynthia. She met my eyes without the slightest hesitation, as though repeating the same story had already convinced her it must be true. A heavy chain wrapped around the entrance gate, secured by a brand-new padlock that certainly had not been there the previous week. Fresh tire marks showed where maintenance crews had recently installed temporary concrete barriers along both sides of the entrance. Someone had clearly invested time and money making sure nobody entered without permission. "Sir," the deputy continued, "until ownership can be verified, I need to ask that you remain outside the gate." I thanked him for explaining the situation instead of arguing. That seemed to surprise everyone standing nearby. Cynthia's confident smile grew a little wider, perhaps expecting frustration or raised voices. She would not get either. Years had taught me that the loudest person rarely controlled the outcome. Quiet paperwork usually did. I stepped out of the truck, closed the door gently behind me, and looked through the iron bars toward the neighborhood where I had spent years greeting neighbors, trimming hedges, and quietly living my life without attracting attention. Then I noticed something else. Mounted beside the gate was a freshly installed sign carrying the Willow Ridge Homeowners Association logo above bold black letters that read, "Authorized residents only. Trespassers will be prosecuted." I read every word twice before folding my arms and smiling to myself. Whoever approved that sign had just unknowingly created the first page of a file they would spend the next several weeks wishing had never existed. I remained outside the gate until the deputies completed their report because making their job harder would accomplish nothing. The evening breeze carried the scent of flowering shrubs from inside the neighborhood, while headlights slowly passed behind the iron fence, residents returning home without giving a second thought to the man standing only a few feet away from his own driveway. After thanking the deputies for treating the situation professionally, I climbed back into my truck and drove to a small hotel less than 10 minutes away. The room overlooked the interstate instead of quiet pine trees, but I had spent enough years traveling for work that unfamiliar ceilings never bothered me. I unpacked my overnight bag, hung my suit jacket in the closet, and placed my worn leather briefcase on the desk beside the window. Only then did I finally allow myself to think about everything that had happened. My name is Daniel Mercer, and for most of my professional life I have worked with community associations, property governance, and the complicated legal framework that allows neighborhoods to manage themselves responsibly. People often imagine my work involves dramatic courtroom arguments, but the truth is far quieter. Most of my days are spent reviewing governing documents, interpreting state statutes, resolving disputes before they become lawsuits, and ensuring that organizations exercising authority remain accountable to the laws that created them. Good community associations strengthen neighborhoods. Poorly managed ones eventually begin believing their own rules exist above the law. That difference has shaped my entire career. 8 years earlier, I purchased my home in Willow Ridge because it seemed refreshingly ordinary. Tree-lined streets, well-maintained sidewalks, families walking dogs after dinner, children riding bicycles beneath mature oak trees, and neighbors who waved from front porches without asking unnecessary questions. I intentionally kept my professional life separate from my personal one. Very few people in the neighborhood knew exactly what I did for a living, and I preferred it that way. Outside the office, I wanted to be another homeowner mowing his lawn on Saturday mornings, trimming hedges in the spring, and quietly enjoying coffee on the back patio while reading the newspaper. I attended community events when schedules allowed, paid every assessment on time, maintained my property carefully, and rarely spoke during association meetings unless someone asked a direct question about a legal procedure. Remaining unnoticed was remarkably easy until Cynthia Reynolds became president 3 years earlier. At first, she seemed energetic and genuinely committed to improving the neighborhood. She organized landscaping projects, encouraged volunteer committees, and spoke confidently about protecting property values. Gradually, however, confidence became certainty, and certainty slowly became control. Rules that once existed to maintain shared spaces began extending into areas where governing documents offered no authority. Letters became more frequent. Committee approvals became more complicated. Conversations increasingly ended with reminders that the board had already decided what was best for everyone. I noticed the change because my profession required recognizing small shifts in governance before they grew into larger problems. Still, I chose not to interfere. Willow Ridge was my home, not my office. Every association deserves the opportunity to correct its own mistakes before outside intervention becomes necessary. As darkness settled beyond the hotel window, I opened my briefcase and removed nothing more dramatic than a legal pad. Across the top of the first page I wrote the date, the time, the names of both deputies, Cynthia Reynolds, and a simple description of the locked gate and newly installed sign. I documented exactly what I had personally observed and nothing more. Assumptions have a short life in legal matters. Carefully recorded facts tend to survive much longer. By the time I closed the notebook, I still had no intention of revealing who I was professionally. Sometimes the most important evidence appears only after people believe they have already won. The next morning I arrived at Willow Ridge just after 8 o'clock, not because I expected the gate to be open, but because daylight often reveals details people overlook in the dark. Thin sunlight filtered through tall pine trees while sprinklers clicked rhythmically across neatly trimmed entrance landscaping. Everything looked perfectly maintained except for the oversized chain still wrapped around the gate and the temporary warning sign fastened beside the keypad. A landscaping crew worked farther down the boulevard, pretending not to notice me as they trimmed hedges. I parked along the public shoulder outside the entrance and quietly began observing. Within 15 minutes, Cynthia Reynolds arrived in her silver sport utility vehicle, carrying a leather portfolio tucked beneath one arm. She greeted several board members with confident smiles before unlocking a small utility cabinet beside the gate. I noticed another freshly installed security camera mounted above the entrance since my previous visit. That interested me immediately. If the association intended to document who entered the neighborhood, then every conversation taking place at that gate now belonged to a permanent record. Cynthia noticed me standing nearby and walked toward the fence without hesitation. "Good morning, Mr. Mercer," she said with practiced politeness. "I hope you understand we are simply protecting our community." I returned the greeting with the same calm tone. From its own homeowners? Her smile never disappeared. From individuals whose residency cannot presently be confirmed. I reached into my wallet, removed my driver's license, and held it where she could clearly read the address. She barely glanced at it before folding her arms again. "The board has already reviewed your situation," she replied. "Until further notice, your access privileges remain suspended." The wording caught my attention more than the decision itself. Access privileges, not ownership, not residency. Privileges. Organizations often reveal their biggest legal mistakes through ordinary vocabulary. Homeowners do not receive permission to access property they legally own. They already possess that right. Around us, several residents slowed their morning walks just enough to overhear the conversation before continuing down the sidewalk. Cynthia appeared completely comfortable performing for an audience. She explained that the board had acted unanimously after reviewing association records, suggesting that protecting neighborhood security sometimes required difficult decisions. I asked only one question. "May I have a copy of the board resolution authorizing my exclusion?" For the first time, she hesitated. Only for a second, but long enough to notice. "Our attorney will provide any necessary documents," she answered before quickly changing the subject. Then she informed me that a special board meeting would take place that evening to discuss continued enforcement actions concerning unauthorized access. I thanked her sincerely for letting me know. She seemed almost puzzled by my response. Most people facing public embarrassment become defensive. I simply wrote the meeting time into my notebook. After she walked away, one elderly resident quietly approached from across the street, carrying a folded newspaper beneath his arm. He lowered his voice before speaking. "Daniel, I have lived here since the first homes were built. I have never seen anyone locked out of their own house." He glanced toward the gate to make certain nobody else stood close enough to hear. "Last week they held an emergency board meeting while you were traveling. They voted on something, but nobody outside the board was allowed inside." I thanked him for the information without asking another question. As he walked away, I looked once more toward the freshly installed security camera above the entrance. Cynthia believed she was documenting my actions. What she had actually created was another independent witness, one that would quietly preserve every decision made at that gate long after memories began changing. Sometimes institutions build the strongest evidence against themselves while believing they are strengthening their authority. I did not attend the board meeting that evening, even though Cynthia clearly expected me to. Sometimes the most revealing conversations happen when people believe the person they are discussing is not in the room. Instead, I returned to the hotel, ordered a simple dinner, and spent the evening reviewing publicly available association records that every homeowner had the legal right to request. Annual meeting minutes, financial summaries, election notices, amendments, committee reports, and archived newsletters slowly formed a timeline stretching back nearly a decade. Individually, nothing appeared remarkable. Together, small inconsistencies began appearing like faint cracks beneath fresh paint. Election notices had occasionally been distributed later than governing documents required. Several board vacancies appeared to have been filled through temporary appointments that quietly extended far beyond the permitted period. Committee decisions increasingly replaced full board votes. None of those issues alone would necessarily create a crisis, but patterns matter far more than isolated mistakes. Shortly before 9 o'clock, my phone vibrated with a message from the elderly neighbor I had spoken with that morning. He did not write anything dramatic. He simply sent a photograph taken from the back of the meeting room. Cynthia stood at the podium pointing toward a projection screen displaying my property address beneath the words "Unauthorized Occupancy Review." I thanked him for the photograph and saved it without comment. The next morning, another certified letter arrived at the hotel addressed to me. Inside was a formal notice from the association informing me that my access privileges remained suspended pending further review and warning that any attempt to enter the neighborhood without board authorization could result in additional enforcement action. I read every page carefully before placing the letter into my briefcase beside the earlier incident notes. The wording remained consistent. Every document referred to privileges while carefully avoiding the subject of legal ownership. By late afternoon, I visited the county recorder's office, where property records have a habit of remaining far more objective than neighborhood politics. The clerk printed certified copies of my recorded deed, tax history, and ownership records without difficulty. Every document confirmed exactly what I already knew. My ownership had never changed. No lien, foreclosure, transfer, or legal restriction affected the property. I requested certified copies anyway because official records carry more weight than personal opinions. Before leaving, I quietly asked whether any document had recently been filed attempting to modify subdivision access rights. The clerk searched thoroughly before shaking her head. Nothing. Outside, warm sunlight reflected across the courthouse steps while a light breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass from the public square. I sat on a nearby bench and organized every document chronologically. My deed, tax records, the association letters, notes from my conversations with deputies, the photograph from the board meeting. Each page quietly supported the next. I still had not contacted anyone professionally. I had not challenged the association, demanded explanations, or revealed anything about my own career. There was no need. Every decision Cynthia made seemed to generate another carefully documented record. Later that evening, I drove past Willow Ridge once more. The chain remained around the gate. The warning sign still stood beside the entrance. Another resident entered using an electronic access card, while the new security camera silently recorded every vehicle passing beneath it. I watched from the public roadway for only a few minutes before driving away again. Looking through the windshield, I realized something almost ironic. Cynthia believed she was strengthening the association's position one document at a time. In reality, every letter, meeting notice, recorded vote, security recording, and formal restriction was quietly building a complete administrative file without any assistance from me at all. The following morning, I checked out of the hotel before sunrise and rented a small office for the day inside a shared business center a few miles from Willow Ridge. The conference room overlooked a quiet parking lot where commuters hurried toward ordinary workdays, completely unaware that a neighborhood association several blocks away was steadily writing one of the most complete administrative case files I had ever seen. I spread every document across the large oak table in chronological order. The certified deed rested beside county tax records. The letters from the association sat next to my handwritten notes from the deputies. Photographs of the locked entrance, the new warning sign, and the security camera mounted above the gate completed the first section. In another folder, I organized copies of the governing documents, election records, meeting notices, and board minutes gathered from publicly available association archives. Looking at everything together revealed something that individual pages had concealed. Every recent action relied on board authority that appeared increasingly disconnected from the governing documents themselves. Mid-morning brought another unexpected development. An electronic copy of the previous evening's meeting minutes appeared on the homeowner portal before the end of the business day, something that rarely happened so quickly. I downloaded the file immediately. The minutes summarized lengthy discussions about community security, unauthorized occupancy concerns, and expanded enforcement authority. They also recorded a unanimous vote authorizing continued exclusion of my property until the board completed its internal review. What the minutes did not include interested me even more. There was no citation to a specific covenant authorizing such action. No legal opinion. No recorded evidence challenging my ownership. No explanation of how a homeowner could lose physical access to private property through an ordinary board vote. The omission quietly answered several important questions. Shortly afterward, my telephone rang. One of the deputies from the first evening introduced himself politely and explained that he wanted to make certain the situation remained peaceful while the ownership question was being resolved. I thanked him sincerely and told him I appreciated the professionalism shown by everyone at the scene. He admitted something that confirmed my own observations. Their report contained no determination regarding ownership because property disputes fell outside ordinary law enforcement authority unless a court order existed. They had simply responded to the information provided at the gate. After ending the call, I added another note to my timeline. Procedure had been followed. That mattered because accurate procedures protect everyone involved, even when the information supplied to officers later proves incomplete. During the afternoon, I visited the state corporation database that maintains public filings for nonprofit community associations. Annual reports, registered agent information, governing amendments, and corporate filings appeared exactly where they should. I carefully compared filing dates against board election records and noticed several discrepancies requiring closer attention. None of them alone would determine the outcome of anything, but together they suggested an organization that had gradually become less attentive to statutory compliance while focusing more heavily on internal control. As evening approached, I placed every document into clearly labeled binders, and locked them inside my briefcase. I still had not revealed a single detail about my professional responsibilities. Cynthia continued believing this disagreement involved one homeowner challenging one board decision. That misunderstanding remained my greatest advantage because she kept responding with additional letters, additional meeting records, and additional documented actions that quietly strengthened the administrative timeline, without realizing each new page fit perfectly beside the last. By the time I left the business center, the evidence no longer resembled scattered paperwork. It had become a complete narrative written almost entirely by the association itself, while my role had been limited to preserving each page exactly as it appeared before anyone had the opportunity to rewrite history. The next several days settled into a routine so ordinary that anyone watching from the outside would have assumed I had accepted the situation. Every morning, I reviewed newly published association notices, checked the homeowner portal for updated meeting records, and documented every additional restriction the board approved concerning my property. Every afternoon, I organized those materials beside certified public records until the chronology became impossible to misunderstand. I still made no telephone calls connected to my professional office. I still filed no formal complaint. Patience remained more valuable than speed. By the end of the week, another certified envelope arrived at my temporary mailing address. This one announced a special membership meeting scheduled for the following Tuesday evening. According to the agenda, the board intended to adopt permanent enforcement policies concerning homeowner eligibility, access authority, and expanded compliance procedures. I read the notice twice before placing it into the same binder that already contained every previous letter. Cynthia continued believing each new document strengthened the board's position. In reality, every additional vote created another administrative record that could later be examined alongside the governing documents and applicable state statutes. On Monday morning, I visited the state archives to verify one final question that had quietly occupied the back of my mind since the locked gate first appeared. The original articles establishing the association, every recorded amendment, annual corporate filings, and statutory compliance reports remained preserved exactly as they had been submitted over the years. I compared those records against the association's own published minutes and election history. Several inconsistencies that had first appeared insignificant now aligned into a recognizable pattern. Required governance procedures had occasionally been bypassed in favor of informal decisions later treated as official policy. Board appointments extended beyond authorized limits. Certain actions requiring homeowner approval appeared instead within ordinary board minutes. None of those issues automatically determined the future of the association, but together they justified something far more important than a neighborhood disagreement. They justified formal regulatory review. I quietly closed the final archive folder and thanked the records specialist for her assistance. She had no idea why I requested those documents, and I preferred to keep it that way. Returning to the business center that afternoon, I opened the locked compartment inside my briefcase and removed the only folder that had remained untouched since this entire situation began. Unlike every other binder on the table, this one contained no homeowner correspondence, no meeting minutes, and no property records. It contained statutory authority, administrative procedures, regulatory guidance, and the official framework governing state oversight of community associations. I reviewed each page carefully, confirming that every requirement for initiating a formal compliance review remained exactly as I remembered. My signature alone would never determine the outcome of any investigation because the law required evidence, procedure, and independent review. Fortunately, the association had spent the previous week supplying an extraordinary amount of carefully documented material. As evening approached, I placed that folder back into the briefcase beside the chronological evidence binders and locked the case with a quiet click. Outside the office window, commuters hurried home beneath the warm glow of the setting sun while traffic flowed steadily along the boulevard. Inside the conference room, everything had become remarkably simple. Cynthia still believed she was preparing for another ordinary homeowners meeting where one resident would finally accept the board's authority. She did not know that every letter, every recorded vote, every access restriction, and every official notice had quietly transformed a neighborhood dispute into a matter that could soon be examined far beyond the entrance gate of Willow Ridge. For the first time since this began, I allowed myself a small smile. I still had not told anyone who I was. They had spent an entire week building a case. They simply never realized which institution would eventually be reading it. Tuesday evening arrived beneath a sky washed in soft shades of orange and blue as residents slowly filled the Willow Ridge clubhouse, carrying folding chairs from storage rooms and greeting neighbors with the easy conversations that usually came before ordinary association meetings. Nothing about the atmosphere suggested that the evening would become anything more than another discussion about landscaping budgets, maintenance schedules, and community rules. I parked quietly across the street, picked up my familiar black leather briefcase, and walked toward the entrance without attracting much attention. Several homeowners nodded politely as I entered. A few seemed surprised to see me there at all. Others quickly looked away, perhaps uncertain whether someone officially labeled an unauthorized resident was even supposed to attend. Nobody stopped me. Nobody questioned me. The meeting room smelled faintly of fresh coffee and polished wood while a projector softly illuminated the front wall behind the board table. Cynthia Reynolds stood confidently at the podium reviewing prepared notes with several board members seated beside her. Stacks of printed agendas rested neatly on every chair. My name appeared nowhere on the document, but one agenda item immediately caught my attention: permanent enforcement policy adoption. I quietly took a seat near the back of the room where I could observe everyone without interrupting the evening. Cynthia opened the meeting exactly on schedule, thanking volunteers for protecting the neighborhood and praising the board for making difficult decisions in the interest of community safety. She spoke smoothly, never raising her voice, presenting every recent action as thoughtful leadership rather than controversy. When she finally addressed my property, she referred to the matter as an ongoing eligibility review involving an individual whose residency remained unresolved. Several homeowners exchanged puzzled looks because many of them had waved to me for years while walking their dogs past my house. Yet nobody interrupted. Cynthia continued describing the importance of giving boards broad discretion when protecting neighborhood interests. She explained that firm leadership sometimes required unpopular choices and assured everyone that every action taken had been fully authorized. Hearing those words, I quietly opened my briefcase beneath the table. Inside, each binder remained arranged exactly as I had prepared it over the previous week. Certified deeds, county records, meeting minutes, election histories, corporate filings, association letters, administrative procedures. Everything rested in chronological order. I removed nothing yet. I simply confirmed every document remained where it belonged before closing the case once again. Across the room, a homeowner raised a hand and politely asked whether excluding a homeowner from his own property required a court order. Cynthia answered without hesitation, explaining that governing authority allowed the board to act whenever necessary to preserve community welfare. Another resident asked whether the county had approved the restrictions. She replied that internal association authority was sufficient while further documentation remained under review. I wrote both answers into my notebook without looking up. Every statement became another timestamp attached to another documented meeting. The board then distributed printed copies of the proposed enforcement policy, asking homeowners to support expanded authority over access decisions involving disputed residency. As papers passed quietly from row to row, I noticed several residents reading the language with increasingly uncertain expressions. The proposal relied on broad conclusions, but cited remarkably few governing provisions. Cynthia concluded her presentation by asking whether anyone wished to speak before the membership vote. The room became completely still. Chairs stopped moving. Coffee cups rested untouched. I stood slowly, picked up the black briefcase, and walked toward the podium with the same calm pace I had maintained since the locked gate first appeared. Cynthia watched me approach with polite confidence, apparently expecting another homeowner complaint that could be dismissed before the meeting ended. She had no idea that for the first time since this entire situation began, I had finally decided it was the appropriate moment to stop acting only as a homeowner. I placed the briefcase gently on the table beside the podium and looked across the room before speaking. Nobody recognized the silence for what it truly was. It was not hesitation. It was the moment when assumptions finally reached the end of their usefulness. Before this meeting continues, I said calmly, I would like the membership to review several public records that relate directly to the actions discussed tonight." Cynthia smiled politely, clearly expecting another disagreement over bylaws or parking regulations. She nodded toward the projector as though granting me a courtesy she believed would change nothing. I connected a small encrypted drive to the projector without hurry. The first image appeared on the screen behind us. It was not a dramatic photograph. It was a certified copy of my recorded property deed issued by the county recorder. The second document showed uninterrupted property tax payments covering every year since I purchased the home. The third displayed the association's own correspondence referring to me by name, while simultaneously claiming my residency could not be confirmed. A quiet murmur spread across the room. I continued without changing my tone. Every document presented this evening is a certified public record or an official communication issued by this association. Several homeowners leaned forward as I opened another binder containing board meeting minutes, election records, corporate filings, and the recently adopted enforcement notices. I carefully explained how each document connected chronologically to the next without offering opinions or accusations. Dates aligned with recorded votes. Letters aligned with meeting minutes. Corporate filings aligned with statutory requirements. The evidence formed a timeline that spoke more clearly than any argument ever could. Cynthia stepped toward the podium microphone and stated that the board had acted under its authority to protect the neighborhood. I nodded respectfully before removing one final folder from the briefcase. Unlike every other folder, this one carried the seal of the State Community Association Oversight Division. For the first time since arriving in Willow Ridge, I identified my professional role without raising my voice. "Outside this neighborhood," I said, "I serve as Deputy Director of the State Community Association Oversight Division. My responsibilities include reviewing compliance issues involving community associations when statutory requirements appear to have been disregarded." The room became completely silent. Even the projector fan seemed louder than before. Cynthia stared at the folder without speaking. I continued exactly as I would during any formal administrative proceeding. I deliberately attended this meeting only as a homeowner until sufficient documentation existed to determine whether further regulatory review was appropriate. The documents generated by this association during the past week now complete that record. I handed copies of the certified materials to each board member before placing a formal written notice on the table. It was not an order. It was the official notification that the association would become the subject of a state compliance review under existing statutory authority. I carefully explained that every organization deserves due process, independent examination, and an opportunity to respond. Any future administrative action, including possible corrective measures or proceedings affecting the association's continued legal standing, would be determined only after a complete investigation conducted according to state law. No one interrupted. Several homeowners quietly reread the documents resting in front of them, while others looked towards Cynthia, waiting for an explanation that never came. She opened her binder, turned several pages, then slowly closed it again. The confidence that had carried her through every previous meeting quietly disappeared beneath the weight of official procedure. I gathered my briefcase, thanked the membership for their time, and stepped away from the podium. Behind me, nobody argued. Nobody raised a voice. The law had finally entered the room, and unlike every rumor that came before it, it required no applause to be heard. 3 weeks later, the chain disappeared from the entrance gate without ceremony. No ribbon cutting marked the change. No newsletter celebrated it. Maintenance workers simply arrived one quiet Tuesday morning, removed the temporary barriers, unfastened the heavy padlock, and loaded everything into the back of a utility truck before driving away. By sunrise the following day, the electronic gate opened normally for every homeowner once again, including me. Autumn air carried the scent of pine needles and freshly mowed grass through the neighborhood exactly as it had before this entire situation began. The only difference was that people now looked at the entrance with noticeably different expressions. Residents who once accepted every announcement without question had started reading meeting agendas more carefully. Attendance at association meetings quietly increased. Homeowners began requesting copies of governing documents before voting on new policies. Questions replaced assumptions, and transparency slowly replaced unquestioned authority. The state compliance review continued exactly as every formal administrative review should. Independent staff examined governing documents, election procedures, corporate filings, financial records, meeting minutes, and enforcement practices according to established statutory requirements. Every organization received the opportunity to respond, provide documentation, and address any concerns identified during the review. The process remained professional, methodical, and free from unnecessary drama, because lasting accountability is built through procedure rather than spectacle. Several corrective actions were recommended, while additional compliance measures were implemented to ensure future decisions followed both the governing documents and applicable state law. Cynthia Reynolds resigned from the board before the review reached its final stage. Her resignation letter thanked volunteers for years of service and expressed hope that the community would move forward together. It contained no explanation for the events that had unfolded, and none was necessary. The official record already spoke with far greater clarity than another public statement ever could. New board elections were held according to the association's governing documents, with independent oversight ensuring every required notice and voting procedure was properly followed. One cool Saturday morning, I finally drove through the entrance gate and continued along the familiar streets toward my home. The tires rolled across the same pavement I had traveled hundreds of times before, but everything somehow felt quieter. Children rode bicycles beneath the oak trees. A neighbor waved while watering flower beds. Someone pushed a lawn mower across a neatly trimmed front yard. Ordinary life had returned, and that ordinary feeling was the most satisfying outcome I could have imagined. I parked in my driveway, stepped onto the front porch, and unlocked the front door for the first time since returning from my business trip. Sunlight streamed through the living room windows, illuminating the bookshelf, the old leather chair beside the fireplace, and the framed family photographs that had patiently waited exactly where I left them. Nothing inside the house had changed. Only the understanding outside had. Later that afternoon, I carried a cup of black coffee onto the back patio as a gentle breeze moved through the pine trees surrounding the yard. I opened my notebook one final time and wrote a single sentence beneath the first entry recorded on the evening I found the locked gate. Case documentation complete. Then I quietly closed the cover and placed the notebook inside my desk drawer beside years of similar journals collected throughout my career. Looking across the peaceful neighborhood, I realized the most important lesson had never been about one board, one meeting, or one locked gate. Organizations are strongest when they respect the limits of the authority entrusted to them. Homeowners are strongest when they understand both their rights and their responsibilities. And the law works best when it speaks calmly through documented facts instead of raised voices. As the evening sunlight settled across the rooftops, the entrance gate opened once more for another family returning home. This time nobody questioned who belonged there. They no longer needed to. The answer had never depended on who controlled the gate. It had always depended on who respected the law that stood behind it.